What's up, Elim fam? This is Minister Keels, and I've been given the opportunity to talk about something that I'm extremely passionate about, and something that I think that we don't talk about enough, and that's mental health. A couple of reasons why I'm passionate about it. One, because it's something I study as I work as a school counselor, but also it's something that I deal with personally. And I don't think that we talk about it enough. We talk about physical health, working out, taking care of your bodies, eating right. We talk about social health and relationships and marriages and things of that nature. We talk some about financial health, and all that's great. All that is necessary and needed. But also, mental health is an extremely important aspect to life. Because I believe that if we don't deal with the mental health, if we're not mentally healthy, then we can never really truly operate fully how God has gifted us to operate. We can never truly be all who God has created us to be because we can't operate at our highest level of efficiency. We can't. Mental health affects how we think. Mental health affects how we act. Mental health affects how we feel, which affect the rest of our lives. So this is something that's important that we definitely need to deal with, specifically because of this coronavirus pandemic that's causing different emotions and different feelings for different people, as you have people who are dealing with isolation and not being able to be around family or friends or loved ones or church family or just people in general. Then you have people who are facing uncertainty when it comes to their financial situation, the next check, the job, and things of that nature. And then you have people who are dealing with family members who are being infected by the virus, or family members who may have passed during this time. And so we're in an interesting time where dealing with people are dealing with mental health at a very high level. But then also just on a regular basis, just not even before the pandemic hit, you have people who are consistently and constantly dealing with mental health issues like depression, anxiety, grief, low self-esteem, working through childhood traumas and all those different things. You have people who are dealing with those specific issues, and the trick is, the difference is, we don't always see it. We can't physically see it on somebody that they're dealing with stuff, but there are people around us, probably people in our houses, people in our families, definitely people in our jobs, and people in our church, who are dealing with these mental health issues, and it's probably more than we know. This is a common thing. It's a common issue, and many of us, all of us, at some point will wrestle with it, will deal with it at a certain point in our lives. And I think that it's necessary that we create a space, that we create a time, create an opportunity to be able to share and to really work through some of these issues, some of these problems, because, like I said, we can't fully be all who God has created us to be if we don't deal with, if we're not prioritizing our mental health. So I kind of want to just give a broad idea of all what mental health deal with, and it deals with our emotional, our psychological, and our social well-being. And like I said before, our mental health affects how we think, it affects how we feel, and it affects how we act. So our mental health goes way beyond just the scope of what goes on in our mind, but it affects our physical presence. It affects our physical presence, but it also affects how we feel on a day-to-day basis. And some of the things about mental health, one of the biggest misconceptions is that a lot of people don't deal with it. And the reality is, like I said before, there are plenty of people in the world, in our communities, in our churches, in our schools, in our houses, in our families, who deal and struggle with mental health issues. It's even as common to, even if you look at doing character studies in the Bible, you see even biblical characters that we hold near and dear to have dealt with some of these issues as well. You see Moses at points dealing with issues. You see Jeremiah at points dealing with issues. You see Elijah wanting to die. You see Paul with a thorn in his side. And we don't necessarily know if it was a real thorn or what the thorn symbolized. But you see all these different biblical characters and people who deal with mental health issues. So it's not something that's just uncommon. It's very common, and the reality is it is okay to not be okay. It's okay not to have everything all together. It's okay to feel uncertain about what's next. It's okay not to be okay. And I think that's something that we have to make sure that we are consistently and constantly reminding ourselves and others that we don't always have to be hopping around shouting and all that all the time. Sometimes we face some difficult and deep struggles, and it's okay. It's okay not to be okay. Another myth about mental health is that it's something that you can just snap your fingers and pull yourself out of. The reality is, for many, it's not something that you can just pull yourself out of. It's not something that you can just change at the blink of an eye. For some of us, it's a process to work through. For some of us, it's something that takes a while for us to work our ways through. And that's okay. You shouldn't feel rushed to try to work your way through your issue, whether it be depression, whether it be anxiety, whether it be low self-esteem, whatever it may be. Don't feel pressured that you have to snap your fingers and pull yourself out of it, because it may take time for you, and that's okay. So it takes time. But the biggest thing, whether it's been mentioned or not, is something that I've heard before, that dealing with depression, anxiety, or other mental health issues means that you are not saved or you have a lack of faith. Like I said, you can see characters in the Bible who struggled with what would be diagnosed now as some mental health challenges. But even in the modern era, there are plenty of people who love the Lord, who are saved, who have great faith, who are faithful disciples, but yet they still struggle with mental health issues. And it's okay. It's just like a physical illness. That's not something that, just because you have a physical illness does not necessarily mean that you are not saved or you do not have faith. It's just an issue for you. And just like that, mental health issues plague some people in the church. And that does not mean that they're not faithful. It just means that they have a struggle. Just like all of us have our own individual struggles. For some of us, that is a mental health issue like depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, whether it be low self-esteem, whatever it is. Some of us struggle with those issues. Some people in your family may struggle with those issues, and we have to be able to create a space for people to be able to share and feel comfortable sharing that they deal with those issues, and to help walk with them through those issues. And some of the causes for those issues can be isolation, and in dealing with this pandemic, is causing isolation. It's causing people not to be able to physically connect with friends, family, or relatives, which for some is extremely difficult, especially when you're used to being able to socially connect with people. Another cause could be bereavement, somebody dying, losing somebody who is close to you, or somebody that you know who's lost somebody that's close to them. There's no way to rush through that. There's no way to just snap your fingers and everything be okay. Grieving is a process. Just like grieving, working through mental health struggles is a process, and it takes some time. Trauma is another cause for it. Whether it be childhood traumas, whether it be something that happened in adulthood, whenever something may have happened, some sort of trauma may have happened, that could be a cause for mental health struggles. And then also financial instability, dealing with this pandemic and the uncertainty about jobs and all those different things can also cause some anxiety, some fear, depression, some suicidal thoughts, and all those different things. And part of the reason why this is my passion is because of how it affects our daily lives. One way it affects us is that it affects how we sleep and how we rest. With the mind going a million miles a minute, or with the mind not operating fully how it should be or how it normally would, it causes us to lose rest. It causes the mind not to be able to get rest, which causes us not to be able to sleep properly, which depletes our energy to fight, to be active, and have the ability to be successful and productive, which then goes back to feed the anxiety that we're not good enough, and it becomes a vicious cycle. So mental health challenges our sleep and our rest. It also affects how we eat. Some people will overeat, which is unhealthy, but then others of us don't eat or will hardly eat at all. And the issue there is, again, it affects our physical health and it affects our energy level. And our energy level causes us to always feel exhausted, which causes us to not feel like we have the energy to fight the necessary battles we need to fight, which causes us to feel anxious and fall deeper into depression. And again, it becomes a vicious cycle that becomes hard to escape. Also, it causes some people to distance themselves from others. It causes people to isolate themselves from those who are around them, because the mind tends to play the trick to say that you're alone, that nobody cares about you, that nobody loves you, that you're going through it all by yourself, that nobody understands what you're going through, which are all lies, but that's what the mind is telling us, and which causes us to distance ourselves from people because we don't want to be a burden, or we just don't feel like people will understand us, or the fear of being judged because of the struggle that we may be going through. So we distance ourselves, which becomes unhealthy, because the further we get away from people who can encourage us and help us and walk us through it, the more the mind plays the trick, the more the mind starts to go in and saying that, and you become affirming those negative thoughts, which drives us into a deeper cycle of anxiety and depression and all those different challenges. Lastly, it affects our physical body. Mental health, depression and anxiety and all those different mental health issues can affect how we physically feel. It can cause challenges with our breathing. It can cause challenges, pains in our bodies, but it also can cause a heavy weight to feel like a burden that is just sitting on top of us, that we're always dragging, that we never have the energy or the strength. And again, it goes into that cycle that we don't have the energy, so our mind continues to just feed us those negative thoughts, and we believe them because we don't have the energy to fight, or we're just so burnt out that we can't fight those different battles. So mental health Those mental health challenges and issues such as depression and anxiety and low self-esteem and suicidal thoughts and all those different challenges can really weigh heavy on us and affect our complete and total holistic life. So those are just some of the, the causes and how they affect our daily lives. But another effect on our lives, and I see it a lot, especially dealing as a school counselor with young people who feel like there is no way out except for death. That there is no way that things will ever get better. It becomes a hopeless despair that things will never get better, that they will always be stuck in that dark space, and that the best way to escape it, the best way to get out of it is by dying. And as heartbreaking as that is, as difficult as that is to hear that some young people, and I'm sure just like some of the young people, some adults feel the same way, that's a reality for many people who are struggling with mental health issues, with mental health challenges, that a lot of us feel as if death is the only way that we'll ever be able to escape the depression or the anxiety or the low self-esteem or whatever it may be. And that is absolutely heartbreaking, because what the mind tells us, especially in the midst of those mental health crises, those mental health struggles, what the mind tells us oftentimes is completely wrong and nowhere close to the truth. But those are some of the different challenges that mental health issues present. But I don't want to just sit there and talk solely about the challenges that they present, but kind of want to give us some practical ideas, some practical things that we can do that might not necessarily snap us out of the mental health, but can get us and help us to move through those mental health issues. So one of the people that I love, one of the biblical characters that I love dearly, is David. David is an incredible character, because we see that David experiences some of the highest of highs in life. David defeats Goliath. David becomes the king of Israel. David is promised that he will always have an heir on the throne. David experiences some of the highest highs, but then also at the same time, David experiences some of the lowest of lows. In his younger days, David almost can be seen as an outcast from the rest of his family. If you remember the story, when Samuel came to find the next king out of Jesse's sons, and Jesse brought all of his sons except for David, and Samuel went through them all and said, none of these are the king. Do you have another son? And Jesse's response was, yes, but he's out in the field with the sheep. Now imagine that this individual knows his family, knows all of his brothers are at a reception eating dinner, and and he's forced to be out in the field with the sheep like an outcast. David also was on the run for his life from his mentor, from somebody he looked up to in Saul. David loved Saul, but Saul was jealous of David and caused David to be on the run for his life. David also, after he became king, was overthrown by his own son. So while David experienced some of these highs, just like many of us experience we have some great experiences. Great things happen to us throughout our lives. But for many of us who deal with those mental health issues, those dark times, many of us, all of us, experience some extremely low lows. And those low lows can almost seem to outweigh the feeling of those highs and those accomplishments. We can see David's story of his highs and his lows if you look at his narrative through 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, but also if you can look into the mind, to the heart of David in the Psalms that he wrote. We can see David oftentimes finding himself in difficult situations, in difficult places, in challenging places where he's asking where God is, but he ultimately flips it and have hope for God because God comes through for David. David is an interesting character, and I want to look at a few of the things from David to kind of give us some encouragement and some hope and some help that when we are struggling with our mental health challenges, when we are struggling with the darkness of depression or despair or grief or anxiety or low self-esteem or self-hatred, or dealing with the trauma of a childhood abuse, or dealing with the trauma of something that happened a few years ago, when we're dealing with our challenges in our dark times, David gives us some insight on some things that we can do to help us to walk through them. First thing, David, in a time of great despair, David found strength to encourage himself in the Lord. If you go to 1 Samuel chapter 30, verses 3 through 6, it says, when David and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. Verse 6 says, David was greatly distressed because the men were talking about stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord, his God. Imagine that. Look. David had been so overwhelmed by his feelings and consumed by the darkness of his circumstances that he and the men that were with him wept so much until they had no strength to cry any longer. And I'm sure for many of us, we've been in a space, in a situation, and in a season where we've cried so much that we didn't have the strength to cry anymore. But then in addition to that, the people that were with David were ready to stone and turn their backs on David. Now imagine this. David has lost his family. His family's gone. Then the people who he's with are ready to turn their backs on him. So I can see David in a space of despair. I can see David in a space of anxiety. I can see David in a space of depression here. But the Bible tells us what David does. David doesn't sulk. David doesn't just complain. David doesn't just sit in it. David found strength in the Lord his God. Another version says David encouraged himself. And I think that's something that's vital for us, that when we're in the darkest moments of our lives, the deepest despair, the most troubling depression, the most heartbreaking anxiety, wherever we may be, where those mental health issues are raging in our minds, we have to take a pause to encourage ourselves. We have to take a pause to be able to find strength in the Lord. That's important. It's important because if we allow our minds to run rampant, we would sit right there in that depression and anxiety and play into the hands of the enemy. We'd play into the hands of depression, into the hands of anxiety. But we have to be able to come to a space where we encourage ourselves, where we have what is called positive self-talk, where we speak positivity to ourselves. That instead of saying that we won't amount to anything, that we are a child of God. that we can do all things through Christ, that we are more than conquerors. We have to get to a space that even in these dark and difficult times, that even when things don't make sense and things are uncertain, that we encourage ourselves, that we become our own cheerleaders. Because the truth is, we might have some of the best friends in the world that we can always talk to, but there are times in life where the friends are asleep or the friends aren't available, when nobody else is around, and we have to get to a space where we're able to encourage ourselves to keep going, to encourage ourselves that we can make it, to encourage ourselves that weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning, to encourage ourselves that this darkness will not last forever, to encourage ourselves that God loves us. We have to get to a space where we become our own cheerleaders, where you look in the mirror and you cheer for yourself, where you cheer the small victories, where you cheer the baby steps that you're able to take towards better. We have to come to a space where we are our biggest cheerleaders. We can't always be our biggest critics. We have to learn how to encourage ourselves and find strength and strengthen ourselves in the Lord. But then, not just encouraging ourselves, but if we look at probably the most widely known psalm ever, Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. One of my favorite scriptures that has recently really become something I cling to is verse 4. Yea, though I walk through the valley in the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, because the Lord is with me. These are David's words. And again, David went through so many different difficult and dark spaces, so many dark places, so many places where David probably would have been diagnosed with depression, anxiety, and all these other mental health challenges. But David here in this dark space is saying, yea, though I walk through the valley in the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. David here is giving us an indication that even though it's dark, that he won't fear the darkness, or he won't fear the evil, because he knows God is with him. But let's look closely at verse 4, because the question now becomes, how do we walk through or survive the darkest valleys, or the valley of shadow and death? I think the first thing, especially from a mental health perspective, is we have to acknowledge the thoughts and the feelings, but not be consumed by them. Watch it. David said, yea, though I walk through the valley in the shadow of death. David acknowledges the fact that he is in a dark space. David doesn't hide it. David doesn't try to repress it. David doesn't try to ignore it and act like it's not there. David acknowledges the fact that he's there. But he doesn't say, yea, though I sit in the valley in the shadow of death. He says, yea, though I walk through the valley in the shadow of death. Meaning what? That David, while acknowledges that he's there, David is also acknowledging that he's not going to stay there, and he's not going to be consumed by the darkness that's there. Something that's important for us when we're dealing with mental health struggles in the face of the darkness of mental health issues and challenges is we have to acknowledge the fact that we are in that space. We have to be honest with ourselves that we are there. We can't just ignore it and act like it's just going to go away. The truth is, we have to acknowledge that we're in that space. We have to acknowledge the negative thoughts that may cross our minds every now and again. Because if we try to suppress it, if we try to hold it in, if we try to act like it's not there, typically it only gets worse. It's almost like if you're trying to hold, if something's not, like when we get physically sick and have to throw up, when it's in there, it's physically making us, it makes us feel horrible. It makes us feel bad. But as soon as we get it out, oftentimes we start to feel better. We can't we can't always just act like we aren't there. We have to acknowledge the fact that sometimes, yeah, I'm in this dark space. But even though I'm in this dark space, even though I'm in the midst of this depressive episode or whatever it may be for you, we have to be sure that while we acknowledge it, we don't get stuck or consumed there. While we may acknowledge the negative thought that may come by, that we don't validate it or we don't just make it the truth. Because like I said earlier, what the mental health challenges does, it causes negative thoughts to be produced in our minds. And if we don't acknowledge those thoughts and confront them with the truth, then those negative thoughts become reality for us. For example, if in the midst of depression, the thought is, nobody loves me, I'm all by myself. Nobody cares, I'm all by myself. That may be a thought that comes for you. The dangerous thing that some people do is they allow that thought to sit with them and don't challenge that thought with the truth. But what we have to do is recognize that we had that thought, but then really challenge that thought. Is it true? Because oftentimes, the majority of the times, the negative thoughts that we have in the midst of our struggles are not true. They're just simply not true. And if we acknowledge it and challenge the thought, then we can recognize, well, that's not true. Because more than likely, there's somebody who cares for you. There's somebody who loves you. There's somebody who's there for you. There's some people who are there for you. So if we learn to acknowledge where we are, acknowledge the thought, but don't validate it and don't just sit with it, we can become more powerful than those thoughts. And we can cast those thoughts out as lies just like they are. David acknowledged where he was, but he did not just make himself comfortable and sit there. David did not get comfortable in the chaos that was surrounding him. And we have to be sure that we acknowledge the chaos, but we don't get comfortable sitting in the chaos. David acknowledged the thoughts and feelings, but he didn't allow them to consume him. But then the scripture literally says, yea, though I walk through, which gives us the indication that David was actively taking steps through his darkness, through the dark valley, through the valley of the shadow of death. David is actively taking steps through it. And so something that we have to do in the midst of our depressive struggles is we have to actively take steps through it. So what does that look like? It's simple. It's simple and it's very practical. One of the steps that we can take through our darkness is to talk about that darkness, to talk about our struggles. Because again, if we try to hold them in, they make us sicker. But if we talk about them and express them with people who we trust, people we know that's not going to go out and tell all our business to the world, we can express what's going on. We can have people and we can really feel the support and love of other people, which can help get us through. So expressing what's going on can be very helpful to us. Even just talking in community can be very helpful to moving through those dark valleys of mental health struggles. Because again, the mental health struggles want to isolate us and keep us by ourselves. But if we push our way to talk to members of our community who we trust, that can be beneficial for us to move forward. Another thing we can do is simply just exercising, moving, stepping, walking, running, jogging, boxing, whatever it may be that's safe. It's something that can help us to walk through and get and get through those challenges, get through those difficulties, get the body moving, get some fresh air, get some sunlight that can help us, that can physically help us, give us the energy to move through those difficult struggles. Developing healthy hobbies. Writing, drawing, singing, knitting, reading, something that's healthy that can help to take your mind off all the chaos, all the jumbleness that's going on in your mind, and focus it on something that you enjoy to do. Developing a healthy hobby is another step to getting us through the valley and the shadow of death. Meditation and prayer. Meditation can help us to breathe. Just taking deep breaths. Prayer. And then meditating on scripture. Meditating on the scripture that feeds our soul. That strengthens our soul. Meditation and prayer can be big time in helping us get through the darkness and the dark valleys. Possible, talking to a counselor, talking to a therapist can help us to walk through some of the issues maybe from the past, some of the difficult struggles that we've dealt with before, or even dealing with now. Therapists are a blessing. Just like we go to a doctor to see about our physical needs, therapists and counselors can help us to deal with our mental needs, can help us to work through our mental struggles. Mine is a major blessing to me because I believe the Lord has spoken through my therapist many a times to me when my mind was too jumbled to hear. So therapists and counselors can be an amazing step to helping us walk through the valley in the shadow of death, to help us to be healthy. But then lastly, David didn't fear because he recognized that even though he was in darkness, he had the Lord with him. Yea, though I walk through the valley in the shadow of death, I fear no evil because the Lord is with me. Ultimately, as believers, as disciples, as people of God, we have to have faith and hope and know that even though we might be in the midst of darkness, that God is still with us. God does not leave us nor forsake us. God does not just leave us on our own. God stays with us. Even in the darkness, David was in darkness and God was with him. But then there's other places in scripture where we recognize God being light in darkness. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is a lamp. The Lord turns my darkness into light. That's 2 Samuel 22, verse 29. Those are the words of David. Yet you, Lord, are my lamp. The Lord turns my darkness into light. David recognized that even though he may be in dark spaces, in a dark place, that the Lord is with him and the Lord can turn his darkness into light. But the real beauty of having the Lord with us in the darkness is that what the Lord brings with what the Lord provides in darkness. Because even in darkness, the Lord provides joy. Even in darkness, the Lord provides peace. Even in darkness, the Lord provides love. Even in darkness, the Lord provides comfort. Even in darkness, the Lord provides strength. The strength to continue to push forward even when everything in your mind is saying throw in the towel. Even when you don't feel like or you don't think you have the energy to keep going, the Lord can provide a strength that allows us to keep going. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up on wings as eagles. The Lord provides strength for us. In the midst of darkness, the Lord provides light for us. In the midst of darkness, the Lord provides guidance for us. In the midst of darkness. And that's what we have to remember, that even though we may be in a dark space, that the Lord provides, the Lord is with us. That God does not leave us there on our own, but God goes with us. That the peace of God goes with us, the peace that passes all understanding, that even in that dark space, that when it doesn't make sense why you have peace, even though you know you're in a dark space, the Lord is with us. The joy that we have, the Lord is with us. And that's something to remember as people of God, that we have access to God. And God doesn't just leave us there. So when we pray, that God hears us in that darkness. And God doesn't just leave us there, but God walks with us through the darkness. So one thing to remember is to have hope and to have faith that you won't always be there. That you always won't be stuck in the darkness of the mental health struggle. But you will come out because God is with you. And because God before you, no darkness, no depression, no anxiety, none of those things can really fight against you. We just have to remember to find God in the midst of darkness. I'm praying for your mental health, praying for your health physically, your family, all that good stuff. But I'm praying for your mental health, praying for your strength, praying for your faith, and praying for your hope. But take those steps to get out of the valley and the shadow of death. You can do it. We can do it. Just never forget that even though it's dark, to not fear, because the Lord is with you. Again, I'm praying for you, praying for your mental health. And I pray this made sense. Connect with some people, get out and exercise, take those steps, and trust and believe that the Lord is with you.